Greetings everyone, and welcome back to Luca Sprues. In today's video, we'll be having a little build and review of the 1/72nd scale Roden Puma, or the Sd.Kfz 234/2. I'm looking forward to having a little build of this one. It's definitely one of my favourite little vehicles from War Thunder, and should be a heap of fun. After washing the parts in warm soapy water, I began by assembling the turret, which was nicely moulded and only required a little bit of sanding. But the mantlet and cannon on the other hand had a fair bit of flashing, so I had to carefully remove this with a sharp hobby knife and then sand any remaining. After a bit of cleanup, I glued the turret and gun assembly together, and then I glued the smoke grenade and the launchers to the turret, which were nicely moulded. I glued the machine gun on and then added on the antennas. I later cut the antennas off because the plastic on them was too thick and it looked unrealistic. I later replaced them with some thin copper wire, which you'll see later on in the video. The wheels and the suspension were the most difficult and time-consuming part of this kit. I cut out the rear of the wheels, axles, the wash to connect the wheel to the axle, the leaf spring suspension and the outer parts of the wheel. All the suspension parts required a fair amount of cleanup, and the axles were very thin and brittle. Due to the small point of contact between the leaf spring and the axle assembly, it wasn't very easy to glue them together, and it required a bit of time for the glue to set and the parts to properly bond. The wheels are designed to steer, however, due to the thickness and brittleness of the axle, it's very difficult to get this assembly to be actually properly built, so for the most part I used blue tack so that I could still pose the wheels in stop motions later on, but if you wish to have this as a static model, I recommend just gluing the wheels so that they don't steer. I assembled all 4 sets of bogies and then began to assemble the hull interior. I didn't bother painting it as it wouldn't be visible in this kit, but it went together easily and the details were alright. The interior parts are intended if you're building a variant of the Sd.Kfz 234 that has an open top, which is another option from Roden's range. I glued the interior to the lower hull and then glued the upper and lower hulls together and held them in place with some Tamiya masking tape. I then began to assemble the storage bins for the fenders. The fenders include some parts to make up the stowage bins, so you could theoretically have the stowage bin open. I would also like to point out that the stowage bin doors had a lot of flashing, which I had to clean up off camera. While those parts dried, I glued the bogies to the lower hull and added a few small pieces to the suspension while they were in place. The fit to the bogies and the hull is good. If you don't line the wheels up correctly, however, they may not rest realistically on a flat surface. So I recommend that you glue the wheels in place after the suspension is on the hull. However, I didn't have too much of a problem lining them up. Then, I glued the fenders to the hull and assembled the last few accessories such as the spare wheels, the stowage bins, and the turret ring, and then I started painting the model. I began by painting the entire model with a thin coat of Tamiya XF57 buff. This coat was followed up by a further 2 to create the base dark yellow colour that German tanks left the factory in during the later part of the war. I paint my coats so that they're relatively thin, watering down the paint as necessary. I also use a large brush and try to apply my strokes in the same direction to ensure a nice uniform paint layer. I also could take the wheels off since I'd blue tacked a couple of them to the hull, which made it a lot easier to paint. I used some Tamiya XF62 olive green for the camouflage and applied it with a nice thin brush. I carefully paint the pattern by hand, looking at the reference photos I have as I do. Most of the time later in the war, German crews would have painted their yellow vehicles with green, red, brown, or sometimes whatever paint they had, according to the environment. I do 2 relatively thin coats of olive green before moving on to carefully painting the tyres with 2 coats of Tamiya XF1 flat black. I try to be careful and make sure the paint is thinned a bit with water so it flows more over the surface of the tyre, but it's still thick enough to build up a layer of colour. If you make any mistakes, you can later touch up the wheel hubs with some Tamiya buff like I did. The next step after painting the wheels is to add on the decals. I simply put the transfer paper in some water for a few seconds, and then once they're loose I slide them onto the model using a paintbrush. The Roden decals seemed quite good in this kit, and they conformed nicely to the model with little fuss, and very little silvering. Occasionally I'll use a sharp knife to carefully move the decals around if they're on the kit, and take care not to scratch the paint or tear the decals. Once all the decals are in place, I then applied some Tamiya decal adhesive to help them stick to the model and conform to the surfaces, and then I left them to dry and move on to painting the exhausts titanium gold, which is X31 on the Tamiya code, and then I follow that up with some Tamiya XF9 hull red to add a bit of a rustic colour to the exhausts. At this stage, I use my fine brush to apply a little bit of buff to help neaten up any mistakes I made during painting the exhausts, the camouflage and the tyres, and then I can move on to the weathering process. I create metal chipping by using a fine brush to dry brush flat aluminium onto the edges of the vehicle and on any areas likely to be chipped, such as the muzzle brake, the hatches, and any surfaces the crew would likely walk on. It's also a good idea to look at reference photos, or even have a little look at some games like War Thunder, which do quite a nice job of rendering a little bit of weathering on the vehicle. Following some chipping, I then brushed a bit of flat black onto the machine gun and the muzzle brake to add some gun stains, and then I applied watered down flat black over the entire model to highlight the surface details and also add a bit of a dirty look and unify the model a bit. I kept the mixture very thin on the upper surfaces, adding a little bit of extra water, and I made it a bit thicker on the underside to create some more shading effects, especially in between the wheels and on the suspension. I added some streaks of flat black behind the exhausts and on the actual exhaust cover, and then once the black wash had dried, I added a little bit of dirt effect by thinning some flat earth and applying it to the areas I wanted dirty on the wheels and on the fenders, before wiping the excess off with my fingers. Finally, I glued on the jerry cans and pioneering tools that come with this kit and carefully painted them with a fine brush before completing the model by gluing on some thin black wire for the antennas. And with that, the model was finally completed. And here we have the finished model. So overall, this model is quite good, I think, especially for the price. It's got a few faults, like obviously the moulding is not the best with the amount of flashing on it, and some of the parts, especially around the suspension, were very tricky to put together, and I don't think they're very well engineered. However, with a little bit of time and patience, you can clean all of the flashing up and you can still assemble the suspension, and I think it still goes together very well. The rest of the kit fitted perfectly once it'd been cleaned up a tiny bit, so no complaints really there. And considering the fact I think I spent about $15 on this one, so for 1/72nd scale and of this quality, it's pretty good. Definitely a good little kit for the price. I would probably say it's a little bit better for the experienced modeler given the amount of cleanup required. However, it's not otherwise too complicated to put together, with exception of the suspension once again. So yeah, like I said, had a lot of fun doing this one. I wanted to do one of these little armoured cars for a while, since I'd played a bit of War Thunder, like I'm sure a few of you have also done. And this is definitely one of my favourites. It's a very speedy little thing, and it's definitely got some very nice looks, and a bit interesting being powered by diesel when the rest of the German army was basically running only on petrol. So that was to adapt it to desert climates, which was the original design requirement for the Sd.Kfz 234s. The other brands that make this kit or this type of vehicle include Airfix, which released, I believe, one of theirs, the vintage models, but it had the Pack 40 instead of the light tank turret from the prototypes that Germany was working on at the time that they later put onto the 234. Italeri also have the Pack 40 model, and I believe it's also quite good. It's one of their newer releases. I believe Hasegawa also make this with the turret, as well as the short-barreled 75 and the Pack 40, but correct me if I'm wrong on any of those ones. I'm also currently building the version by Roden with the 20mm cannon. I can confirm it's got the same kind of problems with flashing, so it must just be part of the tooling. But otherwise, the detail is very good. The decals were pretty good. They didn't silver too much at all, even though I didn't do anything to actually kind of prevent that. Yeah, they conform to the model nicely, and I can still see a little bit of the surface detail below them, so I'm quite happy with them. And yeah, it's just a good little kit. Thank you very much for watching this video. If you enjoyed, please be sure to leave a like. And if you have any questions, suggestions, or other comments, be sure to leave them down below in the comments section. And a special shout out, as always, to my wonderful patrons who've been helping me fund my videos. They include Archie Palmer, Emo, J&K Jones, and Joan Moss. If you want to see some of my little posts and behind the scenes stuff, which I put on Patreon every now and again, be sure to head over there. And I'll also be having a few exclusive behind the scenes stuff posted quite soon. And I'll be changing the voting system. If I haven't done it before this video, I'll be doing it pretty soon. Also, I'd like to mention that this video was done in conjunction with Tectonic Hobbies, where I just so happen to work. We have the wholesaler for Roden, so we can bring in these model kits. I don't believe we have them in stock currently as I'm doing this video. However, if you're interested in doing this kit, then just come on up to the front and me or the friendly and helpful Greg will be more than happy to order in one for you. So that's it for now. I hope you enjoyed this and it was helpful, and until the next video, model on!